So, hi everybody. Hi everybody. Muy buenas tardes a todos. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. Please put your cell phones on silent, but don't turn it off because you're going to need it. I'm going to explain how and why in a minute. So I'm Claudia Palacios. I'm a journalist and an author. And today I'm here to moderate this discussion about one of the greatest challenges Latin America is facing right now. I'm talking about the Venezuelan migration, the mass migration from Venezuela. Why do we call it one of the most important challenges of our region? Here is why. More than 3.7 million people have left Venezuela. Imagine this is the size of the population of a medium-sized country. They have left their country escaping from the harsh realities of living there. This exodus is the second largest in the world after the Syrian refugee crisis. The journey these Venezuelans undertake to get to their destination is treacherous. They cover thousands of kilometers, sometimes through a thick jungle, sometimes on foot, sometimes without any food, to get as far as Argentina, Chile, or Peru, or as close as Colombia and Ecuador. These countries are the gracious hosts of these migrants. And we are here today to discuss the impact on their economies and societies, and also how the international community can help them. Also, very important, we want to look at the opportunities that these migrants bring to Latin America. Our guests include Axel van Trotsenburg. He's our host and also the World Bank Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean. Our panelists are Colombia's Finance Minister Alberto Carrasquilla, Ecuador Finance Minister Richard Martinez, Canada's International Development Minister Marian Monsef, and Eduardo Stein. He's the UN's Special Representative for Venezuelan refugees and migrants in the region. So, that's why I told you, please don't turn your cell phones off. I want you to take your cell phones and please write your posts and your tweets, because we need this conversation to get as big as possible. Invite your followers to follow us. We are streaming online. We are in Facebook and in Twitter and on the World Bank websites. You can join the conversation using the hashtag Venezuelan Exodus, or in Spanish, numeral Éxodo Venezolano. Please use it and send us your questions, because at the end of the panel discussion, we are going to have the opportunity to answer your questions as much as we can, of course. We want to thank our media partners who are carrying this event live. These are El País, the Miami Herald, and El Nuevo Herald, Development Canada, RPP in Peru, EMOL in Chile, El Tiempo from Colombia, Infobae of Argentina, and El Comercio from Ecuador. Thank you to our guests who are already connected to this event. For the people in the room, we have provided cards you have on your seats. Please use it to write your questions and hand it. And there are many of our colleagues here around the room, and you can give them this question to them. Before getting into the panel discussion, let's watch a short video that shows the plight of our Venezuelan brothers and sisters, and hear from the communities that are hosting them.
I'm okay. It was for them, because I'm going to speak Spanish for her.
14 días caminando, o sea, 2 semanas prácticamente para llegar a Ecuador. La comida del caminante, más que todo es pan y gaseosa.
Bueno, lo más difícil es los bolsos de encima, los niños que a veces no quieren caminar, que se cansan, tú no tienes que aguantar un rato.
Por lo menos en los páramos de Pamplona hubieron varios caminantes antes de nosotros, murieron.
Los migrantes vienen a pie, mujeres muy delicadas, mamás a punto de abortar, o señoras con las piernas muy hinchadas, imposible de caminar, personas mutiladas que no podían seguir más su camino.
Está llegando en una pobreza extrema, pero que no tienen prácticamente absolutamente nada, ni para un pañal, ni para la leche, ni para la ropa, ni para nada, que no encuentran absolutamente nada. Y muchos me dicen que están comiendo a veces de las basuras en la calle y eso, y es un drama social muy grande.
Nosotros atendíamos un promedio diario de más o menos 15, 20 personas al día. Pero en este momento las estadísticas nos están mostrando que estamos atendiendo un promedio de 180 a 200 personas diarias. Está desbordado de cualquier precedente que tú puedas tener, no hay nada que lo compare.
Yo dejé todo, mi casa, mi profesión, mi familia. Yo soy abogada y me iba muy bien.
Los estudiantes venezolanos, primero son chicos que vienen completamente tristes, vienen dejando toda su parte, primero material y luego su parte sentimental. Han dejado amigos, han dejado familiares, incluso lloran dentro de las aulas, no se ubican en la institución y realmente en nuestra institución hemos querido que ellos se sientan bien.
Hay la posibilidad para las personas de poder tener un centro de asistencia médica, de poder comer. Además, hay servicios para mujeres que viajan solas, para niños, para adultos mayores. Entonces, un lugar donde las personas puedan, por lo menos, ser atendidas después de días o meses de viaje.
Salimos con nuestras maletas, pero dejando nuestros corazones allá. Es importante el apoyo de todos los países, ya que no es fácil para nosotros sentirnos solos. La proyección que nosotros tenemos es colocar academias, poder recibir a todas esas personas que desean aprender a jugar el béisbol y el softball.
Tenemos ya aproximadamente 7 meses dando clases y la gente que le interesaba se acercaba, mira, quiero aprender y cómo es la cosa. Ya llegará el momento en que pase toda esa situación terrible que está pasando en Venezuela y volvamos, y los que nos sentimos a gusto en este país nos quedamos, pues.
Esta movilidad humana mixta que estamos teniendo no va a parar, es algo que va a continuar, que es impredecible y que se requiere también momentos de inserción en la educación, inserción laboral y también trabajar en la comunidad para frenar la discriminación y la xenofobia.
Si se soluciona mi país, me iría caminando otra vez a mi país.
Me voy siquiera hasta gateando, me regreso a Venezuela.
Voy a ser la primera que me voy a ir.
Yo voy a ser el primero, que así tenga que volver a caminar, regreso a mi país.
These testimonies These very moving testimonies, of course, set the tone of our conversation, as now our host will also do. Please welcome Mr. Van Trotsenburg.
Well, good afternoon. It is over the last 10 years, we have unfortunately seen some of the most terrible mass movements out of countries. You see it in Syria, where over 5 million people left. The last couple of years, we saw the mass exodus of Rohingya from Myanmar, mainly to Bangladesh. And now you see something to Venezuela. And the reason why we want to attract the attention to this is that people cannot imagine that this was previously the richest country in South America, has fallen so deep in its economic and social misery that now about 3.7 million have left their country and more are following every day. And I think that is one of the things what has consequences, apart from what you just saw in the video, the human misery and suffering, but you also see what is the international response. I think what has been impressive has been the response by Latin American government to receive them and actually do their best to welcome. But it has also come to a huge cost. The costs in Colombia are estimated in the order of up to 0.5% of GDP, which is quite a lot for governments to finance. And what it makes it different, I think, with the ulcer crisis in Syria, as well as in Bangladesh with the Rohingya, is the attention that it drew also international support. In the case of Syria, you see that there has been quite a bit of support to countries like Jordan and Lebanon, as well as to Turkey, on the bilateral and as well as the multilateral levels. And there has been an enormous effort to mobilize, particularly grants, financing for this. In the case of the Rohingyas, only the World Bank has been able to provide $400 million in grants through IDA to Bangladesh to cope with these problems. The problem, what we are seeing is that when you are thinking of Latin America, you don't think of this problem. You also don't think these are middle-income countries that can deal with it themselves. So it's no longer a problem, a global problem. And that is, I think, what we are now confronted with, is that this is unfortunately becoming a bigger, not only regional, but potentially also a global problem, particularly if this exodus continues. And we will need to see how we can actually mobilize international support. And I'm not talking about the international support, that there is sympathy for this. There's always sympathy. But at the end of the day, these people need help. And somebody has to also mobilize those resources. And I think this is what is, I think, the biggest challenge that is ahead of us, is how we can actually, in an adequate way, provide the support these people also need.
Thank you, Mr. Trotzenburg. To understand how big is the problem, I would like the ministers of Ecuador and Colombia to tell us about the impact in their economies and their societies. Please start with you, Mr. Carrasquilla.
Well, there have been several studies done on several stresses that the migration is causing in the Colombian economy, is producing. There have been effects in the labor market, which we have been seeing. There have been effects in the fiscal accounts. There have been pressures in security front. There has been pressures in the health system, as we saw in the great video and that we have just seen. So if you add that all up, as Axel was saying, the estimation is somewhere around 1.3 million people are now in Colombia. 700,000 or so have migrated to Colombia within the last year, and the trend is strong upward. There is a strong upward trend. So I guess the final numbers will come in as when the resolution of the Venezuelan situation comes about. So we have to think about that. But so far, the 1.3 million migrants that are in Colombia have implied pressures and stresses that can amount to about 0.5, 0.7% of GDP, which is a substantial amount of money. In terms of dollars, we're talking about something like 1.5 billion or something like that, which is pressuring the Colombian fiscal accounts on a yearly basis. So therefore, it is a big challenge for Colombia from several points of view. And those are the numbers that we have. 1.3 million people, 0.5, 0.8 of GDP are the range of the estimates so far. Per year.
Mr. Martinez, in the case of Ecuador, it's around 230,000
yes.
Venezuelans there.
Yes.
How is the impact of it?
Yes, Claudia, if you let me, I am going to speak in Spanish. I understand that there's the system of simultaneous translation. So
I'm going to say something which is quite pragmatic and commonsensical, but which we often do forget. And this is that in order to resolve a problem, we must find the cause and the origins of the problem. Today, we're vis-a-vis a problem where we cannot actually go to the cause. The cause is the model of socialism of the 21st century, which was implemented in Venezuela, which was attempted also to bring to Ecuador, and which has been implemented also in other countries, and we know what the results of it are. This is the first consideration we must have in mind, otherwise it will be very difficult to resolve the problem. And I bring this to the actual case of Ecuador, where President Lenin Moreno has precisely taken a big turn to leave behind that model of the 21st century socialism, which has, of course, a economic, political, and corruption sides which are very serious. This is what our Venezuelan brothers and sisters are suffering today. In the case of our country, it's about 230,000 people that we have estimated. However, as regards the density of the poor population we have, the effect is even greater in Ecuador because we're a smaller country. And in terms of the size of our economy, as the minister was saying, there is an effect which can be measured as regards the GDP. We think it is 0.5 of the GDP up to 2021. Last year we made an effort which is of more $70 million because we had to broaden the coverage in terms of health and social protection. Every person who arrives in the country must have a guarantee that we will be able to supply them with the basic services and the necessary social protection. In this instance, beyond the actual figures, Claudia, I think it is relevant to ponder on what Axel was telling us as regards the vision that the international community has vis-à-vis this issue. And I deem that still there is no clear awareness as to the effects this might have upon Latin America. I believe that countries have to generate a greater degree of commitment in order to comprehend this problem and avoid going into the field, which is very risky, of xenophobia, because there are also social difficulties that we have to bear in mind. And you were also speaking about opportunities. What we have seen in Ecuador shows us that indeed there is a problem that we have to manage, but it has to do with the labor force that has come in a timely fashion into certain sectors, especially services, and which has allowed us to improve competitiveness in the labor field. Minister Carrasquilla said it already. There are some restrictions to grapple with this issue in the state of Ecuador. First of all, the fiscal problem. As a country nowadays, we're conducting a solid fiscal consolidation to reestablish fiscal balances, and vis-a-vis this scenario, it might be more difficult to intervene as we should. And the other one has to do with the restriction as regards employment. To the extent that we're not able to absorb the population that arrives at the same rate than that at which employment is generated, we start having social tensions stemming from that phenomenon that has to be controlled and managed. And the exchange of experience here is paramount. Meetings have been held among countries, groups have been established, and the support of the World Bank in this case is basic, such as the studies that they have made in Colombia, the one which we're about to conclude in Ecuador now in June. But as regards the numbers, this is a big challenge. We have to transfer this discussion to the human challenge that you have mentioned, and the oranges and the very core of the problem that we have to deal with. This problem will be not just one of Venezuela, but of many other countries in the region.
What about personal experiences with Venezuelan migrants in Ecuador and in Colombia, Minister Carrasquilla, for you to, because we all who live there, we all see the Venezuelans in the corners asking for money, trying to selling things, asking for jobs, and it's another point of view more than the government point of view. What are your personal experiences?
My opinion?
Yes.
Mira, yo tengo...
Look, I have much experience with Venezuelans with whom I've had a chance to work. These are people with whom we have had different migration phases, stages, the first of which was made up by people who had very good learning, talent, and productivity, and who became integrated rapidly to the Ecuadorian labor market with rapid productivity increases. In the labor field, and according to my personal experience, I've been working at least with 6 Venezuelan individuals who are extraordinary and have been able to incorporate themselves very well to the Ecuadorian culture. If we transfer that stage to the next stage, what we are living through today, where migration is much more massive and does not differentiate between those labor capabilities, you start watching the drama nearby, very close by. You see all these people where your children inquire every time you are driving in the car, why is it that these persons are asking for things? Where do they come from? And it is very difficult to explain. Ecuador had an important exodus back in 1999, but I believe that this allows us to give some historical content, and it is precisely that that we should be pointing to. In this field, we are the ones that must bring about solutions. But if you watch the video, and this is something that was led by the migrant Ecuadorian community in the past, the generations of the children, the xenophobia of their parents became reflected. And this is something that we have to deal with. We have to educate our children so that they may welcome the Venezuelan children, so that there will be no discrimination, no xenophobia, and that they may be able to integrate them. That rejection could be extremely perverse, and as opposed to what could be expected, this will increase the poverty belts, generating conditions of poverty which are not positive. We've had negative experience already in our country in this connection, but these don't have to do with the actual origins of the people, but the natural socioeconomic conditions, basically.
Share a personal experience.
Well, the Venezuelan migrants in Bogota did a march in a certain day, and the march was a very peaceful, very I could say even festive. So I began to talk to some of the people, and I confirmed a conviction that I have, which is these are people, and there were various educational levels. You could tell immediately, and there was a diverse set of people, and I was convinced that you know, we are doing a lot in terms of the adjustments that we just talked about, fiscal adjustments, but this is a short-run problem. I mean, there are two things that we always have to keep in mind as we watch the tragedy and the exodus and all of this. And the first thing is, as the minister just said, people, the experience of migration is always a long-term gain for countries that receive the migrants. I mean, we have to keep that in mind, even as we go through this very painful first initial stage. It is always a story that ends well. There is not studies that show that the long-term effect of migration is a bad effect for the country. On the contrary, it is a good effect, and the evidence is out there. The number two is the cause of this is going to go away. I don't know if it will be in 5 minutes or in 5 days or in 5 months, but the origin of this migration is going to go away. And once it goes away, and once this situation is reversed, it is going to be an enormous opportunity for not only the Venezuelan people, but also for countries like Colombia. It is going to be an enormous boost. So we have to keep in focus that we are playing a long game, and that we have to assimilate the short-term costs, because evidence once again and again and again shows that this is a net positive for our country. So we always have to keep that in mind. So that was what I learned from that, confirmed it. You know, watching them in their march, they were protesting, but they would never lose their spirits.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Monsef, maybe your personal story in Canada it shows how Canada is facing or has faced with migration very well. Why don't you tell us about that?
Thank you, Claudia. Bonjour, salam alaikum, and what a privilege it is to be in this room at the World Bank, surrounded by leaders, including Canada's own Chris Hogan, who's in the audience. And talking about people who may not realize that we're talking about them right now. And how much it would help their spirit to know that there are people who don't speak the same language as them, who may worship differently, who come from different walks of life, and yet they care. My Canadian story begins in Iran, where I was born an Afghan refugee to Afghan parents. Afghanistan in the early 80s, you can imagine, was experiencing an exodus of its own. It began with the most privileged, most educated, those with the means being able to leave first, and those with the greatest hope and some denial stayed and took their time, traveled between the border as my family did. And the most vulnerable ended up leaving last, or not leaving at all. And it is their kids and their grandkids who are left to piece back together the broken country and protect it against other challenges. My mom was widowed in her early 20s, and she had 3 little girls. I'm the oldest, and she tried making life work as a refugee in Iran, and that just wasn't feasible. Women don't have the same value as they do in places like Canada, in other parts of the world. Employment was a challenge, and she did not have the same opportunities. Her kids would get some education sometime, and at some point, with 3 little girls and no sustainable income, a mother has to decide whether her daughters get married at an early age, or for a more dignified life, she takes a really big risk and takes my sisters and I to Canada, to a lovely city called Peterborough in Ontario, where my uncle lived. This was in 1996. And we didn't speak the language. And we were dealing with the challenges that come from being uprooted, from leaving behind the people you love, from leaving behind the things that you love, the things that you're attached to, the familiarity, your roots and your ancestors. But we were lifted up knowing that we were about to get a new start in life, a new chance. And I would go on to benefit from a universal healthcare system, from social safety nets, from food banks to social housing. I'd have opportunities to learn the language, to benefit from the public school system that gave me an even playing field, a job at the age of 12, delivering newspapers, and eventually I'd have the opportunity to volunteer and to give back to the organizations that wrapped around my family when we first moved to Peterborough. I was able to get a post-secondary education because there were loans. I was able to get my citizenship because there was an immigration system in place to process all of that. And eventually, in a democratic country like Canada, I was not only just able to vote, but I was able to put my name on a ballot. And I did so because I owe a debt to the people who gave my family and I a second chance. And also because I represent the 1% of refugees, for now, who get the opportunities that I've been provided. And so to be able to serve on Prime Minister Trudeau's first gender-balanced cabinet, to be the first Afghan Canadian in the Parliament of Canada, to be the first Muslim around Canada's federal cabinet, to have the opportunity to welcome Syrian refugees to Canada, and now to be in this role as Minister for Women and International Development, all of these happened by luck. I won the lottery, and my family and I moved to a country that welcomed us with open arms and led us to believe that we have worth, that we belong, and that we can and need to give back.
Mm-hmm. Wow. This is definitely a very inspiring story and very useful for the matter of this panel. Have you ever faced any rejection when you try to participate in government because you're a migrant?
Well, I'm a woman. I'm a refugee. I used to be young. I'm a Muslim from a certain part of the world, and I am representing a lot of change that the status quo is resistant to. So have I experienced pushback? Absolutely. Just Google my Twitter account and see all the hate that comes my way. And there's never been somebody like me in Parliament, and that comes with challenges. And I'm a hippie, grassroots activist turned politician, so that comes with its own learning curve. And fortunately, I have a community that keeps me grounded, a family that believes in me, but most importantly, I benefit from having a prime minister who has created room around that table for voices like mine, who sees value in listening and who sees value in acting on those recommendations. So, yep, there are challenges. A single mom with 3 kids has challenges. A person who has to wake up at 4 in the morning to get to work has challenges. Every single person in this room is dealing with some sort of a struggle on their own. I'm fortunate in that I have a lot of support systems, and the work that I do is supported by partners like those in this room.
And the Prime Minister trusts you a lot because you don't have just one minister, but 2 ministers. You are also the Minister of Gender, right?
Yes, so my job is to take care of women and gender equality at home in Canada because we have work to do at home. And most recently, it's my first month on the job, everybody, so take it easy on the Q&A later. A month ago, he also asked me to take on the role for international development from my predecessor, Minister Bibeau. Minister Bibeau has just become the first woman in Canada to become the Minister of Agriculture. So I take the role on from her as she paves a brand new path.
How do you include the gender factor in this migration challenge?
So the Prime Minister, during the election, the body of a little boy washing up on a shore really became one of those turning points for the Syrian integration and settlement to Canada. And when we were fortunate to be able to form government, one of the first things that the Prime Minister did was establish an ad hoc committee to help settle Syrians to Canada. Our initial goal was 25,000, and to date we have doubled that number, more than doubled that number. And Canada, as you said, Minister, is better off for it. There are social, economic opportunities for us to benefit from having those open doors. Everything that our government does, the Prime Minister has asked that we apply an intersectional gendered lens to it. So, how does this program affect a young, single mom who's moving with 2 kids coming from an urban center to our community, who has a community of her own to take care of her, compared to how does this affect a senior woman with a disability who is illiterate and did not get basic skills training in her country settling to Canada? And every step of the way, the Prime Minister's integrated that lens into everything we do, not just what we do in immigration and settlement of Syrians and other refugees, but also into our budgets, into our hiring, into our assessments. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of really hard work, and we're building up the capacity to do it. But if you see our Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, here, ask him about gender budgeting, and he's one of the main champions for it as well.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Now let me turn to Eduardo Stein. As I said, he's the Special Representative of United Nations for Venezuelan migrants and refugees. How does this migration from Venezuela compares with other migrations in the rest of the world? Mr. Stein.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Let me make a very brief parenthesis. Amongst the list of your qualities, you excluded the word talent. I pay homage to your obvious talent.
Thank you, sir.
Because this is something that in our region in Latin America, we are still experiencing the lack of recognition and the lack of worth bringing to women in our societies. Congratulations also to Canadian country, which is extraordinary example of very many integration efforts of people from all origins. And in this regard, I would like to pick up on 3 dimensions that were mentioned before by both ministers. One is that the root causes of the crisis, and we are dealing with the results from UNHCR and IOM's viewpoint, is not that of an internal war like it has been in Syria, for example. And in Syria, another difference, important difference, is that there were external powers intruding in the internal situation. And a third dimension is that in the Venezuelan crisis, although it seems to be more than anything an internal provoked crisis, it is also a shared responsibility of the whole hemisphere. We saw the signs written on the walls, and we didn't act as a region in time. Having said this, the only other crisis that I know best that somewhat resembles what is going on in Venezuela is what happened in the 80s in Central America, where more than 2 million people were internally displaced or moved transborder way, running away from internal wars. That is not happening in Venezuela. There are other triggering elements within that country. And in this regard, we must not forget that the problem continues, that at about a rate of 5,000 people daily are still crossing the borders of Venezuela into neighboring territories, that we have Venezuelan women and men already in 20 or 21 countries in considerable numbers. Of course, the hardest hit of it is Colombia. That it will not go away even if there is a political solution tomorrow. Because in other experiences around the world, the sudden migration movements take a good of 2 years almost to go back, those that want to go back. But many will undoubtedly remain within the countries that they have managed to establish themselves. So Latin America as a whole will never be the same region. In this perspective, if you want to make comparisons, I would resort very much to what I believe Mr. Carrasquilla mentioned. The minister underscored the positive horizons that lie in the medium term. Aside from the immediate emergency elements that need to be attended, countries, receiving countries and transit countries are looking at medium-term processes of integration. And it's in this regard, Minister Monsef mentioned the cultural dimension that is so important. Even if we speak the same language, with the exception of Brazil, in the mainland Latin America, the cultural integration is playing already a very important role, because this intermingling of experiences in the medium and long term is always an element of fecundity. And however, because it was so sudden, the numbers are so large and the complications so big, governments actually of the receiving and transit countries are experiencing exhausted budgets, overburdened institutional scaffoldings, mostly in health and education, and we are in dire need of a helping hand from the outside of the region.
Mr. Sain, someone who sent a question from Peru previously asks, why do we call them migrants instead of refugees, talking about migrants from Venezuela?
Because indeed, in the opinion of many of us, the frontier between a technically defined refugee and migrant has blurred quite a bit. The fact that many of the receiving countries have, maybe the word is not twisted, but have been inventing new ways of overcoming very strict internal legislation in order to accommodate this enormous influx and provide the proper documentation for those incoming without papers, has indeed produced a phenomenon where the boundaries between a technical refuge in the classical way and a migrant is all but blurred. We are, however, facing a set of extreme needs of those crossing that don't, let me put it this way, that don't allow for the several months processes of granting the status of a refugee. It traditionally took, in some countries, over a year to attain the status of a refugee. However, the needs are very urgent of those crossing at a rate of 5,000 daily still. We had, of course, in August, days of over 19,000 per day. So we have done away with classic definitions and just try to help the receiving countries, the receiving communities, the receiving governments with whatever capacity the UN agencies have, and also through civil society organizations. In this regard, the church has played a formidable job in helping out. So the three different forces, institutional forces, have teamed up together to ease out on these formidable demands.
But the denomination, name, depends on the UN or depends on each country?
No, each country is defining the categories, but let me say each country has exhibited an incredible flexibility to accommodate its internal legislation, to guarantee those coming into their territory either to stay or to walk through a real and concrete set of reaches, accesses, and of course protection mechanisms. That is a kind of generosity that even with exhausted budgets, with overburdened institutional scaffoldings, each and every country is still maintaining.
Okay, maybe later Minister Martinez and Minister Carrasquilla can tell us something about the way you call the migrants or refugees, not refugees for now. Mr. Van Trotzenburg, you were recently in Colombia and also in Ecuador. Yes? Both. And you met with officials, with migrants, with social leaders. So what would what did you see? What did you get from that visit? And how do you explain the work the World Bank is doing there?
So I did visit places where there were the Venezuelan refugees. I think one of the things is what most of the people are struggling with is also with their own dignity, because they have had jobs and they have to leave. The other thing, people are sometimes, because they don't get medical services, they in their desperation would leave, particularly when they have small children, that they had no alternative. So you see that indeed this definition, whether it's a migrant or a refugee, that doesn't come to on their mind is they see they have no more alternatives, and particularly when it is also health related. I think that many people would have preferred to stay in their country if they had the possibility. I think for us as an international organization, what we do is, of course, we traditionally we're never almost in the humanitarian business, because there was always the separation. I think what you're seeing these days is the blurring of development, humanitarian, and the security nexus. And in that sense, we have been rapidly moving into this area. For the poorest countries, where most of the fragile countries are, we have created even a $2 billion window within IDA to provide direct support for refugees. The big challenge is for middle-income countries, of which countries like Colombia and Ecuador are affected, is there are no windows for that support. So we are relying on a trust fund. One was created, this is a global concessional financing facility that has been providing support for countries like Jordan and Lebanon. And Colombia will be also the first Latin American country that will benefit from it, but that will rely on donor support. We have been mobilizing some support. There are countries from Canada, the UK, the Netherlands have been contributing to that effort. But probably more needs to be done on this. We are also supporting directly governments to deal with this challenge through our lending programs. We also do analysis and providing also the support on looking at the impacts for this. Clearly, this is one of the things where we are not working alone. I think this is a challenge of the global community, the host countries, but also the art is now how you work with the UN system, with other multilateral development banks, with other institutions like the International Red Cross, how we can best complement this. The reason are clear, there are very scarce resources, so you better coordinate in the best possible way. But the unfortunate story is that the needs have grown enormously. And that is what we are seeing is the big challenge.
Mm-hmm. Is there any way for countries like Chile, Peru, of receiving the same kind of assistance? You mentioned Colombia is receiving now?
So through the World Bank lending program, we can, and we have the resources on that. If it comes to the concessional resources like grants, there we have to rely on donor support. And as I mentioned, the challenge is to mobilize that support for middle-income countries, is also to be fair to say that the challenges are also enormous for donors, as there are unfortunately a lot of crises elsewhere also in the world. So people are struggling. So it is not that one doesn't want, but there are situations where the situation, believe it or not, is even more dire, and so that is the challenge. In terms of normal IBRD financing, that financing is always available.
Mm-hmm. Minister Monsef, you want to add something?
So, as you know, Minister Freeland, our Foreign Affairs Minister, has been involved in the Lima Group. We'll be meeting on Monday I think they've had over a dozen meetings so far to stay current on the situation. While we all know that there is no place like home, that as we saw in the video, people would rather stay where their roots are. We recognize that many Venezuelans will not return to their home anytime soon. And the humanitarian response is critical, but a more long-term development response is needed. And the more comprehensive our approach is, the easier the strain is on the generous communities who are opening their doors, who are opening their borders, and welcoming their neighbors into their communities. And that's why Canada's announced close to $53 million to support with stabilization, with humanitarian development support, specifically focused too on the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, and to support those hosts who have opened their doors. And part of what was referenced earlier, part of our commitment in Canada has been contributing $17 million to the World Bank's Global Concessional Financing Facility, which will support Colombia's generous approach to integrating Venezuelans, as well as $1 million in technical assistance through the World Bank in direct support of Colombia's migration response. When we apply that gendered lens that I was sharing with you earlier, women and girls, persons with disabilities, we know that they are powerful agents for change, and yet they are undervalued. What if we started providing them with wraparound supports to gain the skills they need to be active contributors to their families, getting on their feet and establishing some level of stability? And so we're working on providing some of that technical support and skills training so that that financial independence can be gained sooner, so that that integration process is less painful, both on the families and generations to come, but also on the communities that are hosting them.
Thank you, Minister. Let me remind the audience, you can follow us using the hashtag Venezuelan Exodus or numeral Éxodo Venezolano. You can send us your questions via Twitter or Facebook too, and we will try to have them answered in just minutes. Minister Carrasquilla, we already said Colombia is the main recipient of migrants from Venezuela. What kind of impact has it had on the country's budget? Recently, President Duque asked to flexibilize the fiscal rule, which is a big word, knowing that risk rating agencies follow that we apply to the fiscal rule.
Well, the number is basically around $1.5 billion per year is our estimation. As long as the flow of migrants continues, that there's a process by which the initial migrants gradually assimilate themselves into our labor markets, into our institutions. The new ones come, so it's basically $1.5 billion per year. So all of this help that we are receiving from Canada, from Norway, from the UK, and the World Bank coordinated all of those donations, amount to a significant amount of money, which is something like $30 million, which we are extremely grateful for, and which we will use very well. But you have to be relative in this, and so $30 million in the $1.5 billion, you know, it is cute. And the second thing I want to say is, you know, we have to think in the financial area. Someday, this nightmare that the Venezuelans are going through is going to end, and the region has an enormous responsibility to be ready, because the day after the solution comes, the Venezuelans are going to need to import food, drugs. They will need trade finance mechanisms which have to be prepared beforehand. We cannot improvise. They will need to reconstruct their electricity sector. They will need to provide water to the population, the basic needs. So I think that the region has a responsibility to prepare itself for that. And I think in that case, when there is light at the end of the tunnel, I think that the real important resources have to be put forth. So in terms of Colombia, we have to take this as a temporary shock, negative for us in the short term, positive for us in the medium to long term. And it is part of our DNA to be part of the solution in Venezuela. Historically, Colombians migrated to Venezuela. So millions of Colombians migrated to Venezuela. So basically it is just reciprocity and a long-term view, but I am concerned about the preparation for the moment in which this problem gets solved. I think that the way we have to finance this, the 1.5 billion has to come from Colombian taxpayers, basically. My concern is what happens the day after the problem is solved. Are we ready for that financially? Are we ready for that technically? Are we ready for that in terms of trade finance? And so on.
What would you say to the risk ratings agencies in the case Colombia needs to move the fiscal rule as President Duque proposed?
Well, we still have the same targets. In fiscal terms, we have the exact same targets, although the people who study this in Colombia and the experts say this is a temporary shock. This is not a permanent shock. Your long-term debt targets are not affected by a temporary shock. They are affected by a permanent shock. So since this is temporary, the fiscal concern is a short-term liquidity concern, not a long-term sustainability concern. So the change in the rule of the fiscal rule does not compromise in any way the sustainability of our finances. Even though it's a lot of money, it's a sustainable expenditure because it is temporary.
Thank you. Minister Martinez, by law, Ecuadorian and non-Ecuadorian people receive basic services in your country, but if the number of migrants increases, are you able to still give this assistance for non-Ecuadorians?
Mira, la ley de movilidad humana.
The legislation of human mobility, and not just that legislation, but the actual constitution guarantee that everybody in Ecuador that have the nationality and have immigrated to the country may have the services and guarantee from the state regarding the social services. The Ecuadorian condition in macroeconomic terms and fiscal sustainability is much more fragile in coming to grapple with this issue. Different from what Mr. Carrasquilla has said, the shock, we have had a permanent shock. We've been having a permanent shock derived not just from external factors, but rather from the public policies that mandate that we make corrective measures in the long term. And this indeed is opposed in one way or the other with this additional effort that has to be made in order to dampen this temporary shock, which is the result and is derived from migration. So there, once again, I believe that we have to think these things over in the long term, not just from the fiscal standpoint, but rather from the standpoint of future risks, that this may not become a permanent shock.
Minister Carrasquilla was saying that we have to think on the day after. The question is, how long will it take for the day after to arrive? And it could become an almost permanent shock. So I think the international community has a responsibility not only to dampen the situation and to shield the migrant population, but also to attack the roots of the problem in order to avoid a persistent problem. To the extent that the Venezuelan model continues, it will be very difficult, and every day will be more and more painful for Venezuelans and more difficult for neighboring countries to receive this diaspora that has been created by this model. So we have to look at it in a comprehensive manner. The financial aspects are very important for countries such as Ecuador that are moving in down the road of fiscal consolidation. The buffers we are using are trying to keep the fiscal consolidation process from affecting the poorest sectors. So we have to enlarge the social safety nets. And if we add this shock, then the risk are greater in the medium to long term not to achieve the stated goals. So it's necessary for us to be aware of the fiscal problem and the funding problem for migration. But it will be solved, but there's a structural problem, and we have to revisit how we're going to manage the day after so that it becomes beneficial for Venezuelans. And in 1999, there was a large migration movement of Ecuadorians to the United States, to Spain, and to Italy. And many of them are thinking about returning if the economic situation stabilizes based on dollarization. That was a drastic decision that the country had to make, but it would guarantee future stability. That's why people are returning to Ecuador. Their children, many of them have become integrated in other communities. But I have the impression that if we compare the migratory process in Ecuador then and the Venezuelan migration nowadays, it will be much more difficult to recover that capability to rebuild the productive scaffolding of society, the cultural aspects of society. So we have to think that it's not just funding our countries in order to dampen the effects of migration, but also the future reconstruction process in a country such as Venezuela, which is not able to be fully supported by its neighbors.
The ones who already wrote the questions, please hand them on, and someone will pick it up. That way, there are someone who are picking the cards, and okay, someone else is coming to pick the other ones. This question says, and I want Mr. Stein to answer this, have any government, the UN or NGO made an assessment of what skills the migrants have so they can be integrated?
Yes. Part of the procedures that have been put in place entail a very quick assessment of the capacities, dexterities, and even professional level of those crossing the borders. Maybe the most sophisticated mechanism to date that has been applied has been done by the Brazilians, because they concentrated in the presidency the coordination of about 11 governmental ministries and general secretaries to precisely try to separate as quickly as possible from the border crossing installations those Venezuelans into other areas of the country. Argentinians have done something similar, because Argentina has enormous void territories that can use different capacities for not only agriculture but many other trades, and therefore there is a very fast way of determining the professional or technical capacity of migrants of both sexes, and then orient those to a counterpart that have been has been provided, sorry, by surveys in the different departamentos or provincias to where there are technical and professional needs of those who can indeed provide services for make those economies grow and flourish. So as quickly as possible, the Venezuelans can become productive agents within those local receiving communities.
At the same time, I think we need to keep in mind that, for example, you take the doctors, that a third of Venezuelan doctors have left their country. And what that means for the Venezuelan healthcare system is catastrophic. So there is, of course, that they will hopefully find then alternative employment, and they are skilled. At the same time, you see that, of course, the gap in the country itself is going to grow in order to provide health care.
Mm-hmm. Minister Monsef, you mentioned something about volunteering when you were refugee, when you just arrived to Canada. And regarding that, I would like you to answer this question from Anna Peters from Facebook. What initiatives can governments implement so that their citizens don't see arrival of Venezuelans as an economic threat?
Thank you for your question, Anna from Facebook. It is really easy to other people and to see them as separate from you and me, they. And it is even more difficult to be welcoming when you yourself and my colleague from Ecuador was talking about this. When your own communities are struggling, it's really hard to swallow the requirement, the expectation that you ought to be welcoming. And it's really easy to pass that down to kids. So I was bullied when I first moved to Peterborough. I didn't speak the language. I looked different. I couldn't make friends. And because I was different, I didn't have value. One of the things that the teacher at that time did, shout out to Mr. Black, he had me do a presentation to the class, and in my very broken English, had me track the routes that my family had traveled and teach the kids a few things about my people. We are actually, as part of our gender responsive investments, our programming includes measures to address xenophobia, to address the social stigmas that could come in. Ultimately, it's first things first, right? You arrive, you need to breathe, let people breathe, make them feel welcome, show kindness to strangers, and then take them out to deliver flyers with you. And if you're looking for kids to sell cookies or whatever, take them with you. That's what the organizations in my community did. The very organizations that gave us shelter had a barbecue every now and then standing outside a grocery store. So they asked us to go and help them. See the value of newcomers, whether you call them refugees or migrants. See the value in them showing up and being productive and giving back as a way of reducing that otherness, reducing the racism, and showing communities what the minister is sharing, that they have value and they can contribute meaningfully.
Thank you, Minister. We are receiving a lot of questions from the room, and we'll answer some online because we don't have any more time. But I don't know if we have a chance to answer one more. If someone from the bank, let me know. Let me see. Last question. If you can, exactly. If you can bring me the question.
Are you wearing heels? That's impressive.
Okay, this question is for the ministers of Colombia and Ecuador. What role do you see for private sector in your countries to support? Oh my God. Migrants.
That's a great question.
Okay, Minister Carrasquilla.
Within the current moment, I think that people have to be flexible in terms of hiring. The labor market in Colombia has been suffering a huge shock. So the private sector has to respond to that. It has to have flexibility. Colombia is not a migrant recipient country historically, so this is new to us, and I think we are all learning. And certainly, as the private sector, as an employer, has to adapt to this very significant shock. The second thing is, once the problem is solved in Venezuela, the Colombian private sector is going to have to play a very important role in the reconstruction of the country. You know, the banking system in Venezuela disappeared. There is no currency. There is no electricity. There is no water. There is no transmission of goods and services throughout the country. The country is uncommunicated. There's very little in the way of communication. So, and perhaps worst of all, human capital has been completely depreciated. So basically, the reconstruction implies a lot of assistance, the reconstruction of institutions, and the private sector in Colombia and other countries in the region have to have an enormous responsibility. I'm really concerned about, we are spending a lot of time, rightfully so, thinking about the tragedy of the exodus, but and we should be concerned about it. We should be doing all that we can. But also we have to be thinking medium term, and I think that we have to be very, very ready. Whether it comes in 5 days or in 5 months, it would be unforgivable as a region to be unprepared. Oh, what a surprise, the problem was solved. If that happens, I think we will have failed as a region and as a community.
Thank you, Minister. What about in the case of private sector in Ecuador, Minister Martinez?
Voy a regresar a
I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning, that we are looking at the root causes of the problem, and the main responsibility, not only for Ecuador and for all the private sector, the church and civil society, is to try to keep these models from being replicated in the region. And I'm talking from on the basis of our own experience. We were very close to that, and we were close to the abyss. And it's very easy, actually very difficult, to think of what would have happened if Ecuador had fallen into the abyss. Under the leadership of our president now, we have more transparency, less corruption, more freedom of expression, sustainability, taking care of the poorest people. So the role of the private sector can be contributing to a joint reconstruction of the country. But this is a task not only for the private sector. So these models have an origin, which is exclusion, inequality, lack of integration, regression. And this means that the private sector should really bear in mind what is expected by society from it in a more active private sector that shares with society. Otherwise, this will create conditions that will lead to populism if the private sector does not respond. Sometimes if you talk to equity, to the private sector, then they run away. That they should be ready to discuss the issue. When I was in the private sector, we worked a lot in terms of gender equality, but it's difficult to reach that level of reflection. I want to insist on this, that as Minister Carrasquilla was saying, this is something more in the longer term. He's talking about the reconstruction of Venezuela. I think this is extraordinary, and I agree with him that we should try to keep this from happening in other countries. for the private sector, up to a point, it has been positive to get this human capital and increase productivity. In Ecuador, the labor framework is very rigid, and it doesn't allow for a quick capture of talent. So unfortunately, the informality has made some room so that small and medium businesses have been able to hire skilled migrants. And the private sector has to look at how it can articulate with the public sector so that in the medium and longer term, the next waves of Venezuelan migrants can decide whether they can stay in the country or leave.
I want to ask our panelists if one of them want to share a final thought on this topic. Mr. Stein.
I would like to take on the three ministers' very valuable inputs. The crisis is very far from over. And even if, as we said at the beginning, tomorrow there would be a political solution, those who understand well the processes of an internationally supervised electoral process, which is one of the elements of the solution, are talking about 8 to 9 months to prepare with the proper international oversight. So the day after is really several months after, as the reconstruction of the own internal health scaffolding and basic services scaffolding is going to entail the constructive intervention in the good sense of neighboring countries that can provide a temporary help to the Venezuelans to shape up back to a reasonable way of functioning, their own institutional capacities. Thirdly, if the flow continues at the rate that it is happening now, without any sudden changes, we will be looking at the end of the year at more than 5 million, without counting those that are crossing already also on a daily basis through illegal pathways. We have decided at UNHCR and IOM to not take into account those illegal crossings, because even with internally informated or well-analyzed guesses, we cannot really verify to the fullest. But if we were to take into account those illegal crossings, we are well over the 4 million mark already. So as a region, as the ministers well said, we have to be prepared for a medium-term attention of those who have already left, as well as of those extraordinary demands that will be placed inside Venezuela after a political solution.
Thank you. Mr. Van Trotzenburg, want to share any final thought?
I think that Mr. Stein is exactly right. We need to be prepared to act now where we can act, particularly with those who are refugees in the neighboring countries. But we have to prepared in the medium and long term to help in the reconstruction of this country. The good thing is that the bank was created for that. It is in the IBR, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The R&D will become important, and you need to stay in the long term to be engaged. And this will require the international community as well as the private sector, because alone, without the private sector, you will also not achieve that. But the bank is ready.
Okay. So thank you to our panelists. Minister, no?
No.
Okay. Thank you to our panelists for sharing this information, for providing these valuable insights, and to the audience for your questions too, for being here. Until next time.